Second six. I have just had a very great privilege. Here in the lobby of the Chrysler Building in New York is the largest collection of American flags ever assembled in one place.
I think I can speak about Nixon's general attitude about Latin Americans. He regarded them as uncivilized and incapable of self-government. This attitude long predated the advent of Allende. In 1958, Nixon was President Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, and he went on a goodwill tour of Latin America with his wife, Pat.
Awaiting him, another of the well-planned campaigns of harassment that have marred every step of his way. The cat-calling mob is kept at bay at the airport as the Nixons enter their cars.
Demonstrators threw rocks at the vice presidential car. A man tried to smash open a car window with an iron pipe.
The mob catches up and attacks the cars with stones and clubs. Mr. and Mrs. Nixon are spat upon and reviled.
Nixon's view of Latin America was undoubtedly affected by this experience. He came to associate Latin America with violence and irrationality. I think he thought that dictatorships and authoritarian governments worked best in Latin America.
As to Kissinger did not know anything about Latin America, and he was not shy to recognize that.
He was an old-fashioned European imperialist, and he shared Nixon's imperial disdain for Latin America.
Kissinger said that the axis of history ran from Washington to London to Berlin to Tokyo. And Latin America, far south from that, did not matter at all.
I think the Nixon administration was hostile to socialism or any idea of socialistic reform.
There's the liberty or death flag, the don't tread on me flag.
But Washington was more tolerant of these reforms in Europe.
There is right behind me the oldest edition of the Stars and Stripes, one which was carried by a Maryland regiment during the Revolutionary War.
In 1974, a socialist government came to power in Portugal, and there was no coup. There was no U.S. attempt to undermine the government.
It was essentially an experiment in overthrowing a government. And so it was like, where's a country that we could, discourage from anything approaching a socialist approach?
And then, of course, there is the famous flag that flew over Fort McHenry when the Star-Spangled Banner was written back in 1814.
And this was one of Kissinger's projects.
The American Legion is sponsoring this exhibit as part of its program to bring new glory to old glory.
Allende just wanted the things that Western Europe could take for granted, such as a living wage and land reform and free health care.
Because I think we all must realize today that this flag, the flag of the United States, which has meant so much for us, is a symbol of hope and liberty not only in the United States, but all over the world today. And consequently, let us bring new glory to old glory by displaying the American flag on Flag Day. Cut.
In March of 1973, there was an election. Allende and the parties of the left win. They won. When we met after the election, the group around Cybersyn, we knew that it was a matter of time, the coup, because they were not going to allow it to happen, to give the opportunity for Allende to win and to develop the economy and society in the directions that neither capitalist groups in Chile nor the United States wanted.
Everyone realized it was all going to go horribly wrong. But I never thought of him as being in danger or in trouble. He was immortal as far as I was concerned. I was 18, you know. You don't consider your parents in these lights. He always made references to the fact that I had no idea what was going on. And and he'd say, if you ever looked at any news at all, you'd be so worried, so just don't, all right? Yep, no problem. He was quite threatened, you know. I don't know if you've seen the famous picture of him sitting at his desk writing in Chile, but that was taken with a telephoto lens, and his team realized that actually he was quite vulnerable and that it would be quite sensible of the Americans to actually shoot him. So he was moved to another location.
La última oportunidad me pueda dirigir a ustedes.
On the morning of September 11th, 1973, the Chilean army surrounded the presidential palace. General Pinochet ordered the Chilean Air Force to attack the palace. Allende ordered his followers to leave the building.
Viva Chile, viva el pueblo, vivan los trabajadores. Estas son mis últimas palabras.
Allende's personal physician found Allende in a chair and a machine gun in his lap with his brain partly exposed.
Pinochet assumed the head of the army appointed by Allende because Allende and the left mistakenly thought that Pinochet was safe. Pinochet had kept to himself even within the military, so not even his colleagues knew really who this guy was.
For the next 17 years, the Chilean people lived under his brutal dictatorship. An estimated 3,500 to 4,000 people were killed during this period, and at least 28,000 people were tortured.
We had a former CIA, employee, who told us that there had been a group within the CIA that wanted to continue to let Cybersyn run to see what they could learn from it. And that person and that group were vetoed because it was more important to make an experiment on overthrowing a government.
Right-wing people had a sort of double view. Some of them thought what we were doing was extraordinary, and that the best thing that could happen is to make use of that. Others thought that that was the way to control people, communist approach. Something like 3 days after the coup, I got a couple of tracks with military people arriving to my house. And what I suddenly realized is that the guy who was directing them was one of the guys who worked for me. And he tells me, they want to hear about the project from you.
The project team had already made plans that the data would be wiped, so it couldn't be used afterwards.
I went to my office, and I found that it had been totally ransacked. As usual, I had good luck. I get a telephone call, and another guy from the team tells me, Raul, what are you doing there? Please disappear as soon as you can. Go. So that was what happened. So I left and arrived to Stafford's house in London.
Stafford came home to England. He had a young wife and 2 young children, and he knew if he stayed, he'd die. When he came back, he cried a lot. He couldn't talk about it easily. He wept.
I tell you solemnly that in Chile, the whole of humanity has taken a beating.
It was very heartbreaking, and of course I didn't know what to do. I'm a kid. But he would sit in his study and talk. He worked very hard, as he did, trying to develop his ideas because he believed he could make it possible for other people to create an effective democracy. He's working very hard on it because he was very anxious not to get it wrong. You know, he wanted it to be exact. I think it was a terrible weight.
Individual freedom has been lost, momentarily at least, in Chile. I think I know how.
He described the only VSM failure that he knew of was the Chilean government.
If we hadn't been so successful, Allende would still be alive, and the democratic government of Chile wouldn't have gone into decline for all those years.
He felt that it was his fault. I'm sure it wasn't. I mean, you know, Allende was in for the chop anyway, let's face it. And then, of course, everything had to change. He wasn't going to keep his life as it was. And he sold the big house and the posh car and bought himself this tiny stone cottage set in some isolated land. He moved out from capitalism, as it were. He decided he would have so nothing to do with capitalism that he'd have to make his own furniture. And so he did. But as he said at the time, he didn't have any skills. It's holes with bits of wood stuck in them. He suffered terribly for that. You know? He had what I think we can now recognize as survivor's guilt. It was a funny time though, because afterwards there was a big university event down at the University of Brighton, and he spoke about what he'd done. And there was this huge backlash with people denying it. It did not happen. And then, of course, there was the headlines saying that Chile had been run by computers and by robots, this kind of thing.
He was very, very unhappy that the potential for that work was lost. And very angry about how it was mischaracterized, as though it was some sort of a totalitarian dystopia.
I resent the blame I've had very much. I've been told that I centralized power for Dr. Allende. This isn't the case at all.
Anyway, it's all very well documented now, and I don't think there's much doubt about the importance of what he did there, or what it cost him. Voila.
One of the greatest shocks visitors to Washington get is to see this sign on the way in from the international airport. And nothing could be more American.
We've learned a lot about what an intelligence agency must do to maintain the confidence of the people.
A mixture of the constitutional right of the people to know what its government is doing, and the right of that government to keep some things hidden. And the CIA affair may help to decide just how many secrets post-Watergate American government is going to be allowed to have.
The attempt of the United States government was not to destabilize or to subvert him. And our concern was with the election in 1976, and not at all with a coup in 1973 about which we knew nothing.
It's this side of the CIA's activities which non-Americans find so hard to stomach.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office. I shall leave this office with regret at not completing my term, but with gratitude for the privilege of serving around the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East. There are millions of people who live in terrible poverty, even starvation. We must keep as our goal turning away from production for war and expanding production for peace, so that people everywhere on this earth can at last look forward in their children's time, if not in our own time, to having the necessities for a decent life.
I stayed in prison for 3 years, almost. In the process of being in prison and reading, I have begun to be more a philosopher. Give me something to think and not to be suffering in the prison all the time. And now the question, what is to be human? How mutual understanding happen? The Cybersyn project was rich in questioning. We anticipate that the fundamental notion for understand computer is support of human conversation, amplifier of human conversation. I believe still valid, that notion.
Now, what I think would have happened if this had been left to evolve, and it would have created, shall we say, a third way. It would not have been the traditional market economy, and it wouldn't have been the traditional socialist economy. Opportunity for a more just structure. Inequality is something that is very strongly connected to the kind of industrial economic system that we know.
Why we have so much connectivity, too much information, and very little wisdom, and a lot of messes and happiness. On the other hand, you cannot get rid of this. It begins to part of the fabric of life. Then we need something that, we need to invent something that grow up from inside and begin to transform the network.
I haven't lost my dreams in this case. I think it may happen that as time goes by, we will learn better how to manage complexity, how to handle big data in ways that are more conducive to justice and to respect.
Then data, by definition, is something dead, something that has to do with the past. But the fundamental phenomenon of human being is social relation between them and create shared horizon of future. But the future is many times unexpected, like the virus, like the end of the Soviet Union, or expected, like a coup, the TAT for us. Then life is an adventure. We need tools for the adventure. We should not package the adventure inside the machines. I believe it's a good way to finish the interview with that sentence.
Cybersyn looked nothing like modern computing, but in 1973, neither did ARPANET. The ARPANET of 1973 connected 40 computers. Now, 22 billion devices depend on the protocols it created. It's hard to imagine a Cybersyn of 22 billion devices. It may have simply failed. It may have led to a more equitable internet. The story of Project Cybersyn will always be a story of what could have been, and for some, what should have been. But in all the questions, one thing is clear. The world outside has always affected what's inside our computers.
The processing and distribution technology and the storage technology are going to make it possible to get over onto a new technological base for intellectual efforts before our ponderous social processes will let us. I think more people ought to get in there and think about the social process.
Well, don't we find ourselves supporting right-wing governments all around the world?
We find ourselves supporting the right, not because we're rightists, but because there literally is no other alternative to chaos.
The material goods of life are going to be increased, but it does raise a fundamental issue as to how what was sometimes called the spiritual aspect of life, or I would prefer to call it the creative aspect of individuality, will be given room for development.
The problem we have is how to reconcile the necessity of the CIA with its secret offenses against our public morality.
There is a strong tendency to speak of the machine as solving the problem, when in fact, really it is the program which describes to the machine what the machine is to do. This is overlooked, and I think a great deal of confusion arises from this. It is not that we do not have adequate machines to solve our problems many times, but rather we lack adequate descriptions of how to solve the problem. And this is a very important point to understand.